Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Supatease here with another video, and there's been a lot of talk about class balance right now, the history of class balance changes in the past, and kind of this fear of what's going on, what's going to happen, and this need for communication at the moment. I just wanted to go over a visualization of the game, the way that I see the game, and I'm going to explain it in a graph and show you what points in the graph the game is the most exciting, what creates the most intensity, and it's all going to make sense really once I get started here. So we're just going to draw an axis. This is not the right opacity. This is a really awkward looking graph. We are going to get something a little more dark. Okay. It's still not dark. This is not the right brush. There we go. That's nice and dark, nice and thick. There we go. Okay. Now, this axis is time. This axis is damage, right? So the most, let's say, notable spec at the moment is Fire Mage. So we'll do this in red here. And for Fire Mage, its damage during without combustion is probably very close to zero. It's almost so low that it's not relevant. However, when you activate combustion, their damage goes all the way up here. So you're going to have this huge spike where the mage is feeling amazing, right? Above and beyond amazing. And it's going to last until it's stopped or prevented. This is damage done without crowd control, right? This is just if the mage attacks and players try and heal. I could redo this with crowd control as well because it does change the graph a bit. But let's just say combustion activates and then they go back down to zero, right? And then it'll repeat over time. Combustion is available. The mage is going to feel fantastic over here. But generally speaking, the rest of the people that have to receive this top end are not going to feel super spectacular. So if we take healers, right? Healers compared to mage's base damage is significantly higher. So much so that the only way to really prevent this would be to crowd control, which would then bring the healing down below. But look how long you would have to keep the target crowd controlled with this minimal amount of damage if they didn't have combust. But if they have combust, if they even bring you down for 2 seconds, you probably already have lost the game. The game is over. This is where the moment of intensity happens, right? This is, all right, crowd control to the healer. They can't heal anymore. They're no longer above us. We're twice their out. We're actually 4 times their output once it's at 0, and we can net a kill in this window. But if they manage to get out of crowd control, they can then activate a cooldown and match us if we're the mage. And then there'll be an equalization, right? A kill won't happen. And then this just keeps repeating over and over and over and over and over at the moment between the best specs, because Fire Mage is able to hit this exceedingly high number. So you can see that it's frustrating for the receiving end of this damage, right? It's frustrating because it's so high, you only have a matter of a couple of seconds to deal with it. And then it's also frustrating for the mage outside of that window because no matter how long they crowd control the healer, once they've returned back to 0, they would have to do it for a very, very, very long time. And then that would also not be exactly the most exciting time as a healer. But if we take other classes that are currently doing a moderate damage at all times, right? Something like a Windwalker monk. I would say that Windwalker monks, without any cooldowns, are much closer to healers. They're probably a little bit less, and this is comparing to the best healers, right? Like Holy Paladin, which if Holy Paladin got tuned down would increase the intensity. But basically, the closer the damage line is to the healer line, the more intense the game, because at any time it could end, right? This moment is created more frequently. But Windwalker is more close to it. So the games that have Windwalker monks in it, or the games that have warriors and Windwalkers and Rets, they all fall into the same category. The intensity is much higher in the game, and you can see that in the tournament when you watch the melee cleaves go into each other, that both teams have to like avoid each other. They have to use mobility and they have to crowd control, and the healers are running out of mana, and it's a very intense game, and that's a very fun experience for myself personally. If it's not fun for you, let me know. But to me, I think that it's a better experience overall to have this intensity as close as possible. So if you crowd control the healer, basically every crowd control matters. The problem comes with Windwalker monks because they can then also activate cooldowns and go all the way up here, which is what makes them really amazing and pairs them up really well with something like a mage as well. So that's why we see those compositions working together so well, is because they can both hit that peak moment, and then Windwalker also, or Warrior or Red or whatever, also comes very close to just the baseline healing amount, and then it will overall increase the intensity. So I'm just trying to like clarify my thoughts with this graph here. So for me, what should be done as far as tuning adjustments or balance adjustments is the classes. There's other classes, right? This is just mage, but you can compare Boomkin. Boomkin's base damage is obviously higher than mage, but I would say we're gonna have to go into the whole debate of impactful damage now too, because you're comparing it to healing. So as a balanced druid, you can keep dots on 3 targets. These dots will not move anyone's health. But at the end of the game, if you maintain the 2 dots and 3 targets, your overall damage will appear very high. And the reason that they don't move anyone's health is because there's just passive healing, and healing is too high. So while balanced druids can do more damage than mages, it's still, I wouldn't say, comparable to the amount of intensity that a Windwalker monk would get on attacking a healer, right? And I'm sure that you've felt that intensity when you're a healer with a monk Windwalker on you versus a healer with a Moonkin on you, right? There's a different level of intensity, and this is mostly a graph of intensity correlated to damage. But Balanced Druid can also hit that spike, but it only hits that spike every 3 minutes, so it doesn't get to do it as frequently, right? Which is why we see mage more often than Moonkin, is then it becomes about frequency. How high can the spec hit this spike? Windwalker has multiple charges of Storm, Earth, and Fire, so maybe they go halfway up to what it would be with that. But then when they have Zwen, they can go all the way up with that, and then they go back down to a moderate level. And then you have some classes that don't have any cooldown damage, right? You can get a Demonology Warlock that's just sitting down here all the time, and then maybe after it takes a long time to get their ramp going and get their cooldowns going, they might not even hit the peak of half of a Windwalker's cooldowns for a little bit of time, and then are stuck down here for the remainder of it. And these are the specs that you don't see, right? Because how can that spec compete? It doesn't hit the peak that it needs to close the game, and its sustain is too much lower than the healer. The only time this spec can then win is dampening, lowering the healer bar down, 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 which is why in a lot of games we see dampening and deep dampening when these classes are in there, and not the classes that are like Windwalker, Warrior, Ret, and Frost Death Knight that have more high sustained damage and the cooldown damage to go along with it. When those classes aren't there, or there's a bunch of these spike classes and only these spike classes, or you just don't see these ones at all because they aren't a spike class and they have no sustained damage, you get very long games, and it requires dampening, because dampening is effectively tuning the healers down to where those specs can actually have a level of intensity, which is often why in those matches when dampening gets very high, the game also gets more intense, but it also is more an enjoyable experience, which is why it's a bit odd to me sometimes when people think like that dampening inherently is a bad mechanic. You could say that, I think the other explanation would be that dampening is a band-aid for having healing too far tuned above a spec, because it's required to tune the healing down to where that spec is in PvP. Now, for me personally, the best experience in the game is when you're in a position like a Windwalker is at the moment. Your sustain is reasonably close to the healer that's currently the most powerful Holy Paladin. If we were to take a Druid, right, you would, or Mistweaver, you would just lower this line. This green one's a Paladin, maybe should have done it in pink, but it'd be a lower line. It can hit sort of close to the same spike. It would be the same as this Demonology. But when you're in the position of a Windwalker, where you can hit the spikes and you've got this relatively close level of intensity, you have a good experience, because it feels that at all times in the match that, or combat, that you can end the game. When you play like a Fire Mage, you will only feel like you can end the game during this one specific window, and everything outside of that is to just prevent enemy attackers from hitting you. And I mean, there is some, I would say there is a legitimate argument for homogenization, right? If every spec is the same line, is that good for the game? Then we can have some debate on strategy options, right? Maybe it is okay to have a spec like a fire mage that is hitting these peaks, but maybe the peak is a little bit too high. I would argue that then the specs that are like this, that are as close to this as possible, where they're just under the healer, have a couple of spikes, would just dominate. Because then the mage only wins in this 10-second window of time, whereas the monk or the warrior or the ret can win almost at any time, which is more fun. So to me, a tuning adjustment would be to bring down the red spike, bring up the red bottom end, so that if a mage gets a polymorph on a healer and they didn't have combust, it still matters. I feel like landing crowd control should matter, bringing the healers down, and then trying to go for a kill. But in the current state, if you don't have combust and you poly the healer, you're not going to really come close to killing a target. And of course, you've got two damage dealers together. That's why the healer needs to be a little bit above, because if they're the same, then one damage dealer kills them. It's going to be very overwhelming for the healer when it's like that. So just close enough that if they crowd control for a decent amount of time, the game can be closed. And then during the spike windows, you need to trade effectively. I think that is good gameplay and outplay factors, like predicting how many resources and cooldowns they've committed, but it doesn't need to be everything. And at the moment, it feels like everything. Now, what happened in Battle for Azeroth is that you had the same type of gameplay, but this red spike, right, couldn't even touch the healer. Let's say in BFA, which is now pink, their healing is up here and can spike up here, right? Now, what happened in BFA, if you're a mage, this graph is getting more and more intense, you were still down here, but your combust also barely got above their base. Just barely got above their base. And what ended up happening in dampening is that dampening was required. Dampening needed to move this healer line down to get to that point of intensity, which is why even in those longer matches, it is very an intense and engaging moment in a game just towards the end of it, because dampening is correcting this basically. Now, this would require, obviously, a lot of PvP-specific tuning. You would have to try and get it so that every healer is close to the same level, which is maybe borderline impossible. Maybe some healers, it's fine for them to be bursty, but in its current state, I feel like it would be better to work towards getting Holy Paladin down slightly and work towards getting DPS specs closer to where Windwalkers, Warriors, and Rets currently sit in power. But I hope that this graph makes sense a little bit. I know what is that? It looks like a kid's crayon drawing here, but I just wanted to give a visualization of what's happening in an arena match, and then what creates the most intensity. And it's this moment where damage is close to healing and any crowd control could matter. And that moment is created when dampening is high. But at the moment, in a lot of the matches that didn't have those classes, right? Because not every game went to dampening. And also, if a team makes an error, the game can end very quickly because this damage spikes so high, right? If the healer doesn't respond, like in a game yesterday, I think with Sea-Doo, they used Convoke the Spirit. So the Boomkin spiked, but Sea-Doo on Paladin didn't bubble. So he didn't match the healing to the damage and died within a couple of seconds of that cooldown by not matching that huge spike, right? So the game can end before dampening. And I think it's a good mechanic in terms of like outplay, but maybe it's too much. Like the spike is too much. You're given 1 second to react, 2 seconds to react. And then outside of that, you can just kind of like, all right, Convoke's not up, and kind of just chill. So I like that outplay moment. And I like the intensity of it, but I think the intensity can be brought all the time or closer to all of the time than it currently is. And then the spikes don't need to be nearly as frustrating with the level of intensity that the cooldowns are currently having. But aside from that, again, my approach to it for fixing, like if you wanted eloquent fixes, is either make dampening start instantly. So dampening will start correcting this graph of intensity a little bit faster. Doing that would also give new players a couple minutes at the start of a game to figure out what's going on, learn how to play, right? Because the intensity is going to be pretty low with no dampening. If you brought down the spikes, it gives them a couple minutes to play, figure out what's going on. But then over time, dampening is going to create this intensity, and you're going to have to figure out what you're doing to be able to close the game out. That would be just a quick way of doing it. It still wouldn't solve the problem for people that are playing specs like Demonology Warlock. that just can't compete in the spike graph and can't compete in the sustain. It wouldn't solve that, but it would make the game more intense to do that, and it's a quicker fix. Another one would be then to nerf the cooldowns or conduits or soul binds that are enhancing these spike moments to bring the spikes down, bring the healing down on the healers that are too high, maybe bring obviously the healing on the healers that are too low up, and then try to have damage slightly below on most specs in PvP, whether it be through main stat tuning, right? So Demonology gets 30% intellect in PvP. This is a random number, right? This would require jumping in and actually getting into the specific tunings to bring Demonology to that same point. So that it feels like it's competitive and it has an intense gameplay experience. And it's there's always going to be a best, right? There's always going to be like Fire Mages right now. It has it more frequently and it's higher. There's always a best, but it can be closer because there's a lot of specs that are just not feeling close at the moment. And not even that they're not better than Mage, it's that they don't have intense moments. They don't have fun moments. So just creating intensity and fun for all of the specs would be my aim. Of course, you want them to be as close to balance as possible, but fun and intensity is lacking on some specs, but other specs are feeling great. That's why it's not all bad in my mind for Shadowlands. And that's why I think there's this initial positive reception of this is better than Battle for Azeroth because these moments happen and these are intense moments. I just would like those intense moments to be happening more frequently, and I think it's possible through some PvP specific tuning. Other than that, thank you very much for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one. Leave it with a like, comment down below with your thoughts, subscribe to the channel if you like this type of content, and I will see you later.